July 16, 1969. The Kennedy Space Center. The air is vibrating with the collective anxiety of a nation. This is the apex of the American century. A 3,600-foot-tall cathedral of fire and metal, the Saturn V, is about to break the bonds of gravity and deliver Neil Armstrong to the heavens. It is the ultimate symbol of democracy's triumph over totalitarianism. The free world is cheering. But if you were standing in the control room that day, listening to the technical directors, you wouldn't have heard the flat, Midwestern drawl of American engineers. You would have heard German. Sharp, commanding, authoritative German. The man who designed that rocket, the man hailed as the Christopher Columbus of the stars, the man smiling on the cover of Time magazine, was Wernher von Braun. To the American public, he was a visionary genius who surrendered to the West to save civilization. But the files deep inside the National Archives tell a different story. They tell us that the technology that put man on the moon wasn't forged in an American laboratory. It was perfected in an underground forced labor facility where the workforce was pushed beyond human limits. The Saturn V was just a V-2 rocket that went to college, and the men who built it didn't just work for the Third Reich. They were the officers who handpicked prisoners to keep the machine running. This isn't a story about forgiveness. It is a story about the greatest laundering operation in history. We didn't just import scientists, we imported a moral virus. And the scariest part? It worked. To understand how the United States government willingly got into bed with the architects of the war, you have to understand the smell of Europe in May 1945. It smelled of ash and the dead. The regime had collapsed, but the conflict wasn't over. A new, silent war had already begun before the smoke cleared. This was the war for intellectual capital. Washington and Moscow knew that whoever captured the minds behind the war machine would dominate the next 50 years. This wasn't a diplomatic mission. It was a raid. The target was something known as the Ozenberg List. In the final desperate days, the secret police had recalled every scientist, engineer, and technician from the front lines to develop miracle weapons. They compiled a master list of the scientific elite. In a twist of fate that feels too scripted for fiction, a Polish lab technician found parts of this list stuffed down a toilet at the University of Bonn. When that wet paper reached U.S. intelligence, the hunt was on. American T-forces, specialized recovery teams, were dispatched with a single objective: secure the assets. But here is the critical distinction that high school history books leave out. They weren't just looking for rocketry sketches or jet engine blueprints. They were looking for living science. The hardware was useless without the minds that understood it. The orders were explicit: detain these men before the Soviets can get to them. If they refuse to come, leave them behind, but ensure they can never work for the enemy. But as the T-forces began rounding up these assets, a horrifying reality began to dawn on the interrogators. These weren't just academics who kept their heads down. These were true believers, men who had utilized the camp system as a petri dish for their research. The U.S. military faced a decision that would define the morality of the Cold War. Do we prosecute the monsters, or do we hire them? You might think that the decision to hire them was a chaotic, spur-of-the-moment mistake made in the fog of war, a lapse in judgment. You would be wrong. It was a calculated, bureaucratic conspiracy that went all the way to the top, designed to bypass the President of the United States himself. And the weapon they used to do it wasn't a gun. It was a piece of stationery. President Harry Truman was pragmatic, but he had lines he wouldn't cross. He explicitly signed an order prohibiting the recruitment of anyone who had been a member of the party or an active participant in its crimes. Based on that order, Wernher von Braun and his entire team should have been facing the executioner in Nuremberg. Enter the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA. This was the deep state before we had a name for it. The military intelligence officers running the JIOA looked at Truman's order and saw it not as a law, but as an obstacle to logistics. They had the dossiers of the scientists in front of them. The files were damning. They contained reports of ardent political sympathies and high-ranking memberships. So, what did they do? They didn't argue with the president. They simply sanitized the files. When a dossier was deemed too incriminating, a U.S. Army intelligence officer would attach a simple paperclip to the new, whitewashed background check. That paperclip was the signal to the State Department. Ignore the past. Issue the visa. Hence, Operation Paperclip. It was a bureaucratic sleight of hand. With a paperclip, a major became a harmless scientist caught in the gears of war. With a paperclip, the man who oversaw the destruction of thousands became a person of special interest to the War Department. This wasn't passive acceptance. This was active fraud committed against the American public and the executive branch. Let's look at the forensic details of who exactly got a paperclip. We aren't talking about low-level conscripts. Take Hubertus Strughold. In the U.S., he became known as the father of space medicine. The library at Brooks Air Force Base was named after him, but back in Germany, Strughold was the man overseeing experiments at Dachau where subjects were frozen, submerged in ice water to see how long a pilot could survive in the North Atlantic. They were placed in pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude ejection until their internal systems collapsed. The data Strughold brought to America was forged in the ashes of the camps, and the U.S. Air Force knew it. They wanted that data. They needed to know how to keep American pilots alive at 50,000 feet, and they decided that the source of the data was irrelevant. We are prying open these archives to ensure history is not rewritten, but algorithms often restrict topics like this under sensitive content warnings. If you want to see the unfiltered truth and support our deep dive investigations, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell right now. Do not let the machine hide this video. And now, let's turn to the chief architect of this system. Let's deconstruct the myth of Wernher von Braun. The popular narrative, the one he carefully cultivated on American television, was that he was an apolitical dreamer who just wanted to go to the moon. And unfortunately, he had to take money from the regime to do it. He claimed he knew nothing of the atrocities. He claimed he was a scientist, not a soldier. This is a lie. Von Braun was officer number 185,068. He held the rank of major. He didn't just wear the uniform for photos, he wore it to meetings with the high command. But his guilt goes far beyond rank. To understand the depth of his complicity, we have to go to the Mittelwerk. By 1943, the Allies were bombing German industrial centers into dust. So, the production was moved underground, into the colossal tunnels of the Dora Mittelbau facility. This was the underworld brought to life. In these tunnels, choked with dust and ammonia, 60,000 prisoners from Buchenwald were used as forced labor to build the rockets that would terrorize London. These prisoners didn't see the sun for months. They slept in the tunnels, stacked in lice-ridden bunks carved into the rock. The air was so foul that the average survival time was a matter of weeks. When they became too weak to work, they were removed from the equation. The production rate of the V-2 was calculated alongside the attrition rate of the workforce. Von Braun was not ignorant of this. He was the technical director. He was there. We have documents signed by him discussing the allocation of labor units. Survivors testified that they saw him walking through the tunnels, stepping over the bodies of the dead, pointing out technical flaws in the fuselage assembly. He didn't see human beings, he saw malfunctioning tools. One survivor, a French resistance fighter, recalled von Braun staring right at him while he was being struck by a guard. Von Braun didn't flinch. He didn't intervene. He checked his clipboard and moved to the next station. When he later surrendered to the Americans, he complained about the delays caused by the deteriorating health of the workforce. This is the man America put on a postage stamp. You might assume that once these men arrived in America, they were kept in isolation, locked in a desert lab, squeezed for information, and then discarded. That would have been the moral compromise. But the U.S. government didn't just want their brains. They wanted them to be neighbors. The integration of the paperclip scientists was total. They were brought to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to Huntsville, Alabama. They weren't treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as dignitaries. They were given housing, stipends, and eventually citizenship. Imagine this scenario. It is 1955. A refugee who survived the camps is working in a diner in Alabama, trying to piece together a shattered life. He looks out the window and sees Arthur Rudolph, the operations director of the Mittelwerk factory, a man who personally ordered the execution of prisoners for sabotage. Driving a new car, laughing with his family on his way to a government job that pays 3 times the average American salary. Arthur Rudolph wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was classified as a 100% believer in his original file, the file the JIOA suppressed. In America, he was a pillar of the community. He worked on the Pershing missile. He received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. It wasn't until the 1980s, 40 years later, that the Department of Justice finally looked into his past. When they confronted him with the evidence of his crimes, he didn't deny it. He simply agreed to renounce his citizenship and leave the country rather than face trial. And von Braun. He became a pop culture icon. He appeared on a Disney program about space travel, explaining the physics of rockets to American children. The man who built the terror weapons was now Uncle Wernher, the kindly scientist teaching the baby boom generation about the future. The whitewash was so effective that when a movie was made about his life in 1960, called I Aim at the Stars, a British comedian quipped the subtitle should be, "But sometimes I hit London." But the darkest irony of Operation Paperclip isn't about the past. It's about the legacy they left behind. We tell ourselves that we used them to win the Cold War, that we extracted their knowledge and threw away the ideology. But when you build your house on a foundation of rot, the rot spreads. The space race was the ultimate PR campaign for the American way of life. It was democracy proving it could out-innovate authoritarianism. But peel back the skin of the Apollo program, and you find the skeleton of the Third Reich. The Saturn V rocket is a direct lineal descendant of the V2. The guidance systems, the propulsion theories, the aerodynamic stress tests, they were all derived from data collected at Peenemünde and Mittelwerk. We have to ask the brutal question, could we have reached the moon without them? Perhaps, but not in 1969. And certainly not before the Soviets. The Soviet Union had their own version of Paperclip, Operation Paperclip. The Cold War became a proxy war between captured German scientists working for Washington and captured German scientists working for Moscow. But at what cost? By granting immunity to men like von Braun and Strughold, the United States shattered its own moral authority. We established a precedent that utility outweighs morality, that if you are smart enough, if you are useful enough to the military-industrial complex, you can get away with mass elimination, literally. This mentality, that the ends justify the means, that national security is a blank check for ethical suspension, didn't end with Paperclip. It became the operating system of the intelligence community. You can draw a straight line from the rationalizations used to protect von Braun to the darkest chapters of modern intelligence history. When Neil Armstrong took that one small step, the world saw a victory for humanity. But the ghosts of Dora Mittelbaugh were watching too. 20,000 people died building the V2 rocket. More people died making the weapon than were killed by its impact. That is a statistical anomaly unique in the history of warfare. And the man who orchestrated that industrialized destruction was the same man catching confetti in New York City ticker-tape parades. Operation Paperclip forces us to look in the mirror and ask, how much of our modern world is built on the bones of the innocent? We want to believe that science is neutral, that technology has no politics. But the rocket that took us to the stars was fueled by the suffering of the forced. The dossier is closed. The men are dead. But the question remains, When we look up at the moon, are we looking at a monument to human potential or a tombstone for our conscience? The answer, unfortunately, is hidden in the files that didn't have paperclips attached. End of transmission.